Friends, before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to my channel, hit the notification bell so you never miss a new audiobook, and give this video a thumbs up. Thank you in advance. Red Hood and the Village of Desire. The path was a familiar scar through the ancient woods, a ribbon of packed earth she had walked 100 times before. But today, the scent of damp pine and loam was different, headier, as if the very air had been spiced with a forgotten secret. Alara, though in her mind she was already becoming Red Hood, named for the impractical crimson-dyed wool of her cloak, pulled the hood tighter around her face. The gesture was meant for comfort, a shield against the creeping unease. It was a gift from a grandmother she barely remembered, a woman whispered to have had wild eyes and a knowing smile. "Wear it when you feel lost," she'd said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "It will remind you of the blood in your own veins." Alara felt lost now. The landmarks, the lightning-struck oak, the trio of moss-covered stones, had dissolved into a monotonous tapestry of trunk and shadow. The sun, a pale coin above the canopy, offered no direction. Panic, a fluttering bird against her ribs, began to beat its wings. She walked faster, her boots sinking into the soft mulch, the undergrowth snagging at her skirts. The forest was no longer a place of transit. It had become a living, breathing entity, and it was watching her. It was the silence that broke first. Not a true silence, but the absence of the familiar chatter of jays and the distant rush of the river. In its place was a low, thrumming hum, like the string of a cello plucked deep within the earth. She pushed through a final, defiant wall of ferns, thorns catching on the brilliant red of her cloak, and the world fell away. The village lay in a hidden valley, cradled by mist and twilight, though the hour was barely past noon. It was a place untouched by time, or perhaps existing in a time all its own. The cottages were built of woven willow and dark, seasoned timber, their roofs thick with living sod and wildflowers. Smoke, smelling of applewood and something sweetly herbal, curled from hearths. There were no straight lines, no sharp corners. Everything flowed, curved, embraced. And the people, they moved with a languid, unself-conscious grace that made the hurried pace of her own world seem vulgar. A woman with silver-streaked hair laughed by a well, her hand resting on the arm of a man half her age, the contact easy and full of a heat that made Alara look away, her cheeks flushing. A figure detached itself from the shadows of a doorway and approached. He was tall, with eyes the color of weathered bark, and he moved with the quiet authority of the forest itself. "You are off your path," he said, his voice not a question but a statement. It was a rich voice, one that seemed to resonate in the hollow of her stomach. I was going to my grandmother's," Alara stammered, clutching the basket she carried. It held nothing but a loaf of bread and a pot of honey, tokens of a duty that now felt absurdly trivial. "The path to your grandmother's is long gone," the man replied, a faint, knowing smile touching his lips. It faded with the last echo of her laughter. "You are here now. This is the village of the unbound. I am Kaylin." He didn't ask her name. His gaze fell to the Red Hood, and he nodded slowly, as if confirming a long-held suspicion. "Come. You are weary from your journey, and the forest disorientation clings to you like cobwebs." He led her to a small cottage at the village's heart, larger than the others, with a great gnarled oak growing through its very center. The main room was a single circular space, dominated by the tree's massive trunk. The air was warm, thick with the scent of beeswax candles and dried herbs hanging from the rafters. A low, wide bed piled with furs and woven blankets occupied one curved wall. There was no door to separate it from the rest of the room. "Rest," Kalen said, his hand hovering near the small of her back, not touching, yet she felt the warmth of the almost contact through her clothes. "When you wake, the world will have settled. Or perhaps," he added, his eyes glinting, "you will have begun to settle into this one." Alone, Alara sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns on a wool blanket. The sheer, unapologetic carnality of the place was a shock to her system. Through the open window, she saw a couple in a neighboring garden, not in frantic passion, but in a slow, tender exploration of each other's skin, their movements a silent conversation of give and take. There was no shame in their touch, only a profound and quiet reverence. It was not the act itself that stunned her, but the context, the way it was woven into the fabric of the day, as natural as breaking bread or drawing water. That night, she was drawn from the cottage by the sound of drums. A fire roared in a central clearing, its light painting the faces of the villagers in flickering gold and deep umber. They danced, not in pairs but as a single pulsing organism. Bodies swayed, brushed, and parted in a rhythm that was as old as the earth. A woman with eyes like embers took Alara's hand, her skin surprisingly cool. She drew her into the circle, into the thrum of the music. "Don't think," the woman whispered, her breath a warm caress against Alara's ear. "Just feel the beat. It is the heartbeat of the village. It is your own." Alara let herself be moved. The crimson cloak swirled around her, its color deepening in the firelight. The fluttering panic in her chest began to change its rhythm, melting into a different, warmer, more unsettling sensation. A slow, coiling heat in her belly. A man with hands stained from berries and soil danced close, his hip grazing hers, a spark of contact that jolted through her. He smiled, a flash of white in the dark, and then moved on, his touch a fleeting gift asking for nothing. Later, back in Kalen's cottage, the scent of smoke and sweat still on her skin, she lay awake. The memory of the dancing, of the casual, purposeful touches, played behind her closed eyelids. She was a virgin not just in body, but in the understanding of her own physicality. In her world, desire was a transaction, a prelude to binding, to ownership, to the heavy weight of a wedding band. Here it seemed as light and as free as the fireflies drifting in the night air outside her window. Kalen entered silently, moving to wash his face in a basin across the room. He removed his tunic, and in the candlelight, she saw the map of his life written on his skin scars, the ripple of muscle, the soft dusting of hair across his chest. He was not a young man, but his body spoke of strength and a deep, grounded vitality. He felt her gaze and turned, his eyes meeting hers in the dim light. He didn't cover himself. He didn't smile. He simply held her look, allowing her to see him, and in that unguarded moment, he was offering her a glimpse of a philosophy she could not yet name. "You are watching the old world fall away," he said, his voice low. "It is always frightening, and it is always beautiful." He did not come to her. He simply lay down on a pallet on the far side of the room, giving her the vastness of the bed and the privacy of her own tumultuous thoughts. Alara curled her fingers into the furs. The red cloak, draped over a chair, seemed to drink the faint light, glowing with a soft internal radiance. She was lost. She was found. She was terrified. And for the first time in her life, the blood in her veins felt like it was singing a song she was only just beginning to understand. The path behind her was gone. There was only the unknown, intoxicating path ahead. The village did not operate on the frantic, grasping energy Alara had associated with desire. Instead, it moved to a rhythm of deep, patient saturation. Her days began not with the shrill call of a clock, but with the slow infusion of light through the oak leaves in her ceiling, and the sound of Kalen moving quietly about the cottage, preparing a tea that smelled of bark and honey. He was a quiet guardian, his presence a constant, low-grade warmth in her periphery. He answered her questions not with lectures, but with observations that turned her own questions back on herself. "Why is touch so public here?" she asked one morning, watching two villagers, a man and a woman, share a long languid kiss by the community well before parting ways to their daily tasks with a simple, unpossessive smile. "Is it more honest than the furtive glances and hidden assignations of your world?" Kalen countered, handing her a clay mug. "Here, a touch is a sentence, a kiss a paragraph." The couple by the well were concluding a conversation they began at the fire last night. It was a full stop, not a secret. Alara sipped the tea, its warmth spreading through her. Her first true encounter was with the woman from the fire, the one with ember eyes. Her name was Lyra. She found Alara in the village's communal bath, a natural hot spring sheltered by a grove of weeping willows. The air was thick with steam, carrying the mineral scent of the water and the faint, floral perfume of the oils the villagers anointed themselves with. "You carry your body like a burden," Lyra observed, her voice a soft melody against the trickle of water. She was submerged to her shoulders, her dark hair floating around her like a halo, as if it is something to be managed or hidden. Alara, self-consciously hugging her knees to her chest in the water, could not deny it. "Come," Lyra said, and it was not a command but an invitation. She led Alara to a smooth, flat stone at the water's edge. "Lie here." Trembling, more from the exposure of her soul than her body, Alara complied. The stone was warm from the sun filtering through the willow fronds. Lyra's hands, slick with scented oil, found the tense knots of her shoulders. There was nothing overtly sexual in the touch, not at first. It was a re-education. Lyra's fingers spoke a language of pressure and release, tracing the map of Alara's anxieties, the rigid line of her spine, the tight cradle of her pelvis. "This is where you hold your fear," Lyra murmured, her thumbs working a tight coil of muscle between Alara's shoulder blades. "And this," her palms slid down to the small of Alara's back, "is where you lock away your hunger." A sob caught in Alara's throat unbidden. It was true. Under Lyra's ministrations, her body began to speak back, not in words, but in a loosening of joints, a softening of flesh, a slow, warm tide of sensation that had nothing to do with thought and everything to do with feeling. When Lyra's hands finally gently coaxed her thighs to relax, parting them just enough to allow access to the deeply clenched muscles within, Alara did not resist. The touch was clinical in its purpose, yet profoundly intimate in its effect. It was not an invasion but a liberation. A wave of pleasure, so sharp and pure it was almost painful, broke over her, and she cried out, her fingers scrabbling against the smooth stone as tears mixed with the steam on her cheeks. Afterward, floating in the water, feeling weightless and utterly new, Lyra smiled at her. "The body is not a temple to be worshipped from afar, little red. It is a river to be swum in, a forest to be explored. You have just heard it speak its own name for the first time." This awakening continued, each experience a lesson in a different dialect of pleasure. There was Finn, the berry-stained man from the fire, whose touch was like the sun-warmed earth. Their coupling was in a sun-dappled clearing, a frantic, joyful, laughing tangle of limbs that was as much about the feel of grass on her back and the sight of clouds racing overhead as it was about the final shuddering release that left them breathless and side by side, staring at the sky. Then there was the silent weaver, a man named Oren, who taught her the art of slowness. In his candlelit workshop, surrounded by the whisper of wool and loom, he undressed her with a reverence that made her feel like a sacred text. For hours, it seemed, he did nothing but map the landscape of her skin with his lips and fingertips, the delicate hollow of her throat, the sensitive inner curve of her elbow, the backs of her knees. He worshipped the journey, not the destination, until her entire being was a single straining note of anticipation, and her climax, when it finally came, was not an explosion but a deep, resonant unraveling that left her trembling and weeping in his arms, not from sadness, but from the sheer, overwhelming beauty of being so thoroughly seen. Through it all, Kaylin was her anchor. He watched her transformation with the quiet satisfaction of a gardener watching a rare bloom open. One evening, as she returned to the cottage, her skin humming, her cloak seeming to glow with a deeper, more vibrant crimson, he finally spoke his philosophy aloud. "You are learning the grammar of desire," he said, stirring a pot of stew over the hearth. "But you must now learn the higher syntax. You believe because you have been taught that this," he gestured vaguely, encompassing her encounters with Lyra, Finn, and Oren, "is a path that leads to love. A transaction, where pleasure is the currency to purchase a heart." Alara paused, a loaf of bread halfway to her mouth. He had named the unspoken assumption that still lingered in her heart. "Love," Kaylin said, his voice low and sure, "is a magnificent chain. It binds, it holds, it possesses. It asks for tomorrow and the day after. Desire, pure desire, is the key to the lock. It exists only in the present tense. It asks for nothing but the truth of the moment." He ladled stew into a bowl and handed it to her. "True freedom, Alara, begins only when you can separate the act of sex from the demand for love. When you can give your body without feeling you must also mortgage your soul. Passion without possession. Freedom without shame." The words settled in her, as warming and unsettling as the first sip of his tea. They were a heresy that felt like a revelation. She thought of Lyra's joyful independence, of Finn's easy departure, of Oren's silent, non-possessive adoration. They loved perhaps, but they did not cling. Their desire was a gift, freely given and freely withdrawn. That night, for the first time, she did not sleep alone in the large bed. She went to Kaylin's pallet. She did not do it out of a sense of owed debt, or the budding tendrils of romantic love. She went to him as a student to a master, to offer the proof of her understanding. He accepted her not with the frantic hunger of Finn or the artistic reverence of Oren, but with a deep, earth-shaking certainty. He was the forest ancient and knowing, and she was the river finally learning its course. It was a consummation not just of bodies but of an idea. And when it was over, she lay curled against him, her head on his chest, and felt not the anxious need for a promise of tomorrow, but a profound and perfect peace in the silent, shared darkness of now. The red cloak, hanging nearby, pulsed softly as if in approval. The village was preparing for the long night. It was not a festival Alara recognized from any calendar of her own, but a turning of their own private world, a ritual woven into the very bones of the valley. The air, always thick with promise, now crackled with a new, sharper energy. The languid days of her initial education were over. The village was moving with a focused, anticipatory grace. Kalen became less a quiet guardian and more a dedicated tutor. His lessons were no longer just philosophical musings by the hearth. They were practical, physical, and demanding. Desire is not just about receiving pleasure, he told her one afternoon in a sunlit glade, his voice stripped of its usual warmth, leaving only a core of flint. It is about wielding it. It is a current. You have learned to let it flow through you. Now you must learn to direct it. He taught her the art of breath, of controlling the tiny muscles deep within her, of building the inner fire until it was a banked coal she could summon at will. He taught her to see the subtle tells in a partner's body, the flicker of a pulse in the throat, the slight parting of lips, the dilation of pupils, the silent language of wanting. Under his guidance, her body became not just a vessel for sensation, but an instrument for its creation. She learned to draw sounds from him, deep groans of surrender, that she had never thought the stoic Kalen capable of making. It was a heady power, and it frightened her even as it thrilled her. The long night arrived on a tide of perfumed smoke and the insistent primal beat of high drums. The central fire was not just a bonfire. It was a pyre of scented woods and resins that sent twisting phantom shapes into the darkening sky. The villagers gathered, their bodies anointed with ash and ochre, their eyes reflecting the flames, bright and feral. The usual easy laughter was gone, replaced by a tense, shared silence. Lyra found her ember eyes glowing. She wore a crown of withered nightshade. Tonight is not for learning, Red. It is for being. The veil between what we are and what we desire is at its thinnest. Do not think. Do not question. Simply become. The drumming shifted, becoming a frantic staccato heartbeat that seemed to vibrate in Alara's teeth. The villagers began to move, but this was not the flowing dance of her first night. This was a ritualized, almost violent pantomime of pursuit and surrender. Bodies crashed together in the firelight, not with tender exploration, but with a raw, hungry urgency. It was desire stripped bare of all its poetry, reduced to its most primal, beautiful, and terrifying essence. A man she didn't know, his chest glistening with sweat, pulled her into the whirl. His hands were rough on her hips, his mouth hot on her neck. There was no conversation, no gentle preamble. It was a claiming, and for a dizzying moment, the part of her that Kalen had been cultivating responded. A raw, answering hunger surged up in her. A need to be taken, to be consumed by this anonymous, firelit hunger. But then a memory flickered. The memory of her grandmother's quiet cottage, of the simple, predictable rhythm of kneading bread, of a love that was safe and certain, if perhaps a little dull. It was the ghost of the woman she had been. A final plaintive cry from a world that was fading to a dream. The conflict paralyzed her. She stood frozen in the center of the roaring chaos, the heat of the fire on one side, the chilling memory of a lost home on the other. The anonymous man, sensing her retreat, released her with a grunt of disappointment and melted back into the throng. Kalen was there instantly. He did not touch her. He simply stood before her, his body a still point in the maelstrom. His eyes held hers, and in their weathered depths, she saw no judgment, only a profound, unshakable question. This is the choice, Alara. His voice cut through the din, calm and clear. This is the fulcrum. You can hold on to the shore, to the memory of a safe, small love. Or you can let the current take you. You can surrender to the truth of your own hunger, without shame, without the need to call it by any other name. He held out his hand. It was not the hand of a lover asking for her heart. It was the hand of a guide offering the final key to a kingdom she had spent weeks wandering. She looked at his hand, then at the swirling, ecstatic faces around her. She saw Lyra arched back in abandon. She saw Finn, his head thrown back in a roar of release. She saw the raw, unvarnished truth of their freedom. It was terrifying. It was magnificent. The memory of her grandmother's cottage dissolved, not with a whimper, but with the sound of a silken thread snapping. A great silent sob racked her frame, and then a wave of calm. She placed her hand in Kaelin's. He led her not to a private corner, but to the very heart of the firelight, to a bed of furs and dark petals laid out for this purpose. What followed was not a coupling, but a coronation. It was the culmination of all his teachings. She was no longer a passive recipient. She was an active, equal participant in the creation of a shared, transcendent reality. She met his every movement with her own, her body speaking the language of power he had taught her. The world narrowed to the feel of his skin, the sound of his breath, the fire-hot connection where their bodies joined. It was passion without plea, ecstasy without apology. When the peak came, it was not a single shattering moment, but a series of endless rolling waves that seemed to tear a cry from her very soul. A cry that was part pain, part triumph, and wholly, utterly free. The red cloak, which she had not even realized she was still wearing, seemed to ignite, the crimson fabric glowing as if woven from the very embers of the fire itself. As she lay spent in Kaelin's arms, the drums slowing to a steady, satisfied pulse, she knew. The timid girl who had wandered into the valley was gone, consumed in the ritual's fire. The woman who remained knew her own hunger, her own power. She had chosen the current. She had chosen to be unbound. The morning after the long night dawned with a profound and liquid silence. The frantic energy of the ritual had been spent, leaving in its wake a valley steeped in a deep, satiated peace. Elara woke in the great bed, alone. Kaelin was already at the hearth, his movements as quiet and sure as ever, but when he turned to hand her a cup of tea, his eyes held a new, unspoken respect. She had passed through the fire. She was no longer his student, but his peer. Her transformation was now internal, a quiet revolution in her soul. The lessons of the village, once shocking and foreign, had become her own native tongue. The frantic, exploratory phase of her awakening was over, replaced by a deep, settled confidence. She no longer sought out experiences with the hunger of a novice. Instead, she moved through the village's days with the easy grace of a native, and the experiences found her. She spent days with Lyra, not in the passionate, instructional dynamic of before, but in a quiet, sisterly companionship. They would weave together by the stream, their fingers working the wool in a shared, meditative rhythm. Their conversations were not about the mechanics of pleasure, but about its echoes, the way a certain quality of afternoon light could feel like a caress, or how the memory of a touch could warm you days later. Their own intimacy became a different language, one of gentle, knowing comfort, a shared understanding that needed no words. It was desire as a quiet hum in the blood, not a roaring fire. Her encounters with others in the village took on this new quality. A shared glance with a woodcarver across the communal meal could lead to an afternoon in his sunlit workshop, a slow, smiling exploration that felt as natural as breathing. There was no performance, no frantic grasping for climax. It was an exchange of presence, a celebration of the body's capacity for joy. She learned the pleasure of the pause, the space between heartbeats, the exquisite tension of a breath held and slowly released. She discovered that power lay not only in taking charge, as Kaylin had taught her for the ritual, but also in the absolute vulnerability of surrender, when offered from a place of strength. The red cloak was now a part of her, an extension of her skin. It no longer pulsed with dramatic light at moments of high passion, but seemed to hold a constant, low thrum of warmth, the color of wine held to the sun. The villagers looked at her not as a curiosity or an initiate, but simply as red. She belonged. It was during this time of settled belonging that the first faint whisper of the outside world tried to find a purchase in her mind. It came not as a clear memory, but as a sensation, the crisp, starched feel of her old linen shift, so different from the soft, draped wool she now wore. The taste of plain, unspiced porridge. The sound of a church bell, tolling a duty she could no longer name. These were not yearnings but ghosts, faint and insubstantial. She would shake them off like drops of cold water, turning her face back to the sun, to the scent of baking bread from the communal oven, to the easy touch of a friend's hand on her arm. Kaylin watched this internal settling with a knowing eye. One evening, as they sat watching the stars pierce the velvet sky, he said, "The final lesson is not about holding on, but about letting go. Even of this." She looked at him, the peace in her chest tightening into a knot. "Let go of this? Why would I ever want to?" "Not want," he corrected gently. "Need. A river that does not flow becomes a swamp. To be truly unbound is to understand that all states are temporary. Even paradise." He gestured around them. "This village, this life. It is a perfect moment. But no moment lasts forever. To cling to it is to betray the very freedom it has given you." His words frightened her. For the first time in weeks, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. She had found her home, herself. The idea that it was just another step on the path, and not the destination itself, felt like a betrayal. Yet, as the days blended into one another in a golden haze, she began to understand the subtle truth in his warning. The intensity, even this new, peaceful intensity, could not be sustained forever. The sheer perfection of it all began to feel fragile, like a soap bubble, iridescent and beautiful, but destined to pop. She found herself watching the shifting patterns of the mist in the valley with a new, faint ache, a premonition of loss woven into the fabric of her contentment. The knowledge of her freedom was now tinged with the knowledge of its inevitable cost. She was blooming gloriously, but even the most beautiful flower knows the secret of its own ending. The perfect, seamless tapestry of Alara's life in the village began to show its first threads. It started subtly, like the first chill wind that whispers of a turning season. The vibrant, saturated colors of the valley seemed, at times, to bleed at the edges, fading for a heartbeat before snapping back into focus. The ever-present, low thrum of desire that pulsed through the community would occasionally stutter, replaced by a silence that felt hollow, not peaceful. She was gathering mushrooms with Lyra in a damp, shaded part of the forest when it happened. Lyra was laughing, her voice a clear bell, telling a story about Finn's first, fumbling attempt at the fire ritual years ago. Alara reached for a clump of chanterelles, their orange a vibrant splash against the dark earth, and her fingers passed right through them. She stared, uncomprehending, at the undisturbed mushrooms, then at her own solid hand. A cold dread, entirely separate from the forest's cool air, trickled down her spine. "Lyra," she whispered, her voice shaky, "did you see that?" Lyra turned, her smile gentle but her eyes holding a deep, ancient sorrow Alara had never noticed before. The veil is thin here, Red. Sometimes other realities press close. It was not an answer. It was an evasion. The encounters that had once been lessons in freedom began to feel different. The touch of the woodcarver, which had once felt like a sun-warmed benediction, now carried a faint, desperate edge. His kisses felt like questions to which she no longer knew the answers. During a celebration under the new moon, she watched the villagers dance, and for a terrifying moment, their movements seemed less like a joyful expression and more like a ritual performed to keep a terrible silence at bay. Their passion felt like a shield against a void she could only sense, not see. She confronted Kalen in his workshop, where he was carving a piece of oak into a shape that was both wolf and man. "What is happening?" she demanded, the fear making her voice sharp. "Is the village dying?" Kalen did not look up from his work. His hands, steady and sure, continued to shape the wood. "Nothing that is real can die, Alara. It can only change form." "That's not an answer," she cried, the frustration boiling over. "I'm fading. The world is fading. I reached for a mushroom and my hand went through it." Finally, he set down his knife and looked at her. His gaze was heavy with a love that was vast and impersonal. Like the sky loving a bird it must eventually watch fall. "You are remembering," he said softly. "Remembering what?" "The other truth. The one you left at the edge of the forest. This place, it exists in the space between a breath. It is sustained by belief, by the choice to be here. You have learned everything we have to teach. The final choice is not about surrendering to desire, but about choosing which reality you will anchor your soul to." He walked to the window, looking out over the misty valley. The village of desire is not a place on a map. It is a state of grace. And all states of grace are temporary. To believe otherwise is to build a prison of paradise. The truth of his words landed on her like a physical blow. This wasn't her home. It was a way station. A beautiful, profound, life-altering dream from which she was being asked to wake. The red cloak on her shoulders felt heavy suddenly, not like a symbol of power, but like a chain of gorgeous, heartbreaking gold. That night, she did not join the others. She walked to the edge of the village, to the very spot where she had first stumbled out of the forest. She looked back at the candlelit cottages, at the silhouettes of lovers against glowing windows, at the entire impossible world that had remade her. She could feel its pull, a siren song of endless, shame-free pleasure. But she could also feel the pull of something else, a memory of a straight-back chair, of a simple loaf of bread cooling on a windowsill, of a love that was perhaps less ecstatic, but was promised to last a lifetime. She stood on the threshold, poised between a glorious dream and a complicated truth, the fraying edges of both worlds tugging at the seams of her soul. The village was not vanishing because it was an illusion. It was vanishing because her need for it was. She had drunk from its cup, and now she was full. The only thing left to do was to carry that nourishment back into the world of hunger. The morning arrived wrapped in a peculiar silver stillness. The air itself seemed to be holding its breath. Alara woke with a clarity that was absolute and unnerving. The frantic fear of the previous days had burned away, leaving behind a quiet, profound resignation. She knew with a certainty that settled in her bones what she had to do. Kalen was waiting for her by the hearth, a small woven basket in his hands. It was identical to the one she had carried into the village, the one that had held the bread and honey for a grandmother who now felt like a character from a story read long ago. "The berries at the sunning stone are ripe," he said, his voice calm and matter-of-fact, as if commenting on the weather. "They would make a fine preserve. Would you gather them?" It was not a question. It was a ritual. The sunning stone was a flat, gray slab a short walk into the forest, a place she had been to a dozen times. A simple, mundane errand, the kind of task one gives to a member of the household. The profound weight of the moment was cloaked in the utterly ordinary. She looked at him, this man who had been her guide, her mentor, her lover, the architect of her liberation. There were no words adequate for the goodbye that hung between them. To speak it would be to shatter the delicate magic, to acknowledge the end and thus make it crude and painful. So she said nothing. She simply took the basket, her fingers brushing his. The contact was electric, a final silent transmission of all that had passed between them. She walked through the village. She saw Lyra, who paused in her weaving and offered a small, knowing smile that was also a farewell. She saw Finn, who gave her a slow, respectful nod. They knew. They all knew. This was the way of things. A soul arrives, is transformed, and departs. The village remained. A crucible for others, perhaps, or simply a perfect idea waiting for the next hungry heart to stumble upon it. She did not look back. She passed the last cottage, the scent of wood smoke and baking bread clinging to her for a few last steps before the deep, damp scent of the pine forest took over. The path was familiar, soft with needles. Sunlight dappled the ground. She could hear the chatter of birds. Real birds. Not the symbolic thrum of the village's hidden heart. The world felt sharper, louder, more distinct. She reached the sunning stone. The berries were indeed ripe, fat and dark purple, bursting with juice. She began to pick them, her movements methodical, her mind perfectly, terribly empty. She focused on the task. The snap of the stem, the weight of the berry in her palm, the gradual filling of the basket. It was a meditation against the rising tide of grief. When the basket was full, she stood. She turned to go back. But the path was different. The gentle, winding trail she had followed was gone. In its place was a narrower, more rugged track, one she did not recognize. The light had changed. The golden-green filter of the village's forest replaced by a harsher, more common daylight. A cold mist began to coil around the tree trunks, thin and spectral. She walked, her heart starting to hammer a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The trees seemed to shift as she passed them, their branches rearranging themselves in her peripheral vision. The air grew colder. The sounds of the village were gone, utterly. There was only the crunch of her own feet on the path and the ragged sound of her own breathing. She walked faster, then broke into a run, the basket of berries clutched tightly to her chest. The mist thickened, blinding her, and for a moment, she was utterly lost in a formless gray void. She stumbled, her foot catching on a root she couldn't see. And then she fell. Not onto soft moss but onto hard-packed earth. The mist cleared as suddenly as it had come. She was on her hands and knees, breathing heavily. She looked up. The forest was gone. She was at the edge of a field, a familiar field, with a familiar, well-worn track leading to a cluster of cottages in the distance. The sky was the pale, washed-out blue of a late afternoon in her own world. She could hear the distant, mundane lowing of a cow. She slowly got to her feet. Her body ached, not from the fall, but from a loss so profound it was a physical pain. She looked down at herself. Her simple, draped woolen dress was gone. She was wearing the stiff, practical clothes she had worn the day she got lost. The homespun skirt, the linen blouse. But on her shoulders, the crimson cloak remained. It was not glowing. It was not pulsing with power. It was just a cloak, a beautifully dyed piece of wool. Yet, as her fingers came up to clutch its fabric, she could feel it. Not a memory, but an imprint. A permanent tattoo on her soul. The knowledge of her own hunger, her own power, her own freedom. It was real. It had all been real. She turned, searching desperately for the path, for the mist, for the hidden valley. There was only the ordinary field, the ordinary path, the ordinary sky. The village of desire had vanished, leaving no trace but the woman it had created and the red cloak on her back. She was home. The walk to her grandmother's cottage was a march through a ghost world. Every sound, the creak of a weather vane, the slam of a distant door, was jarringly loud and coarse. The air smelled of dust and cooked cabbage, a stark, unperfumed reality after the village's symphony of wood smoke, honey, and skin. Her body, so recently an instrument of exquisite sensation, now felt like a heavy, awkward shell. The memory of Kaylin's touch, of Lyra's hands, of the firelit dance, was a fresh wound beneath her skin, aching with a phantom bliss. She pushed open the door to the cottage. Her grandmother looked up from her knitting by the fire, her face a mask of familiar, gentle worry. "Alara, thanks the heavens. You're half a day late. I was beginning to fear the wolves." The words were mundane, suffocating. Alara's gaze fell on the simple loaf of bread on the table, the pot of honey beside it, tokens of a life she had left behind. "No wolves, grandmother," she said, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears, layered with a new quiet depth. "Just a long path." She stayed. There was nowhere else to go. She resumed the rhythms of her old life, the baking, the cleaning, the tending to the garden. But she moved through it all with a new detached grace. The young men of the village, who had once seemed like potential suitors, now appeared as boys, their desires simple, their touches clumsy and full of unspoken expectation. She would smile, polite and distant, and they would eventually retreat, confused by the unbridgeable chasm in her eyes. She wore the red cloak every day. The villagers whispered. They called her Red Hood not as a term of endearment, but as an identifier for the strange, quiet woman who had returned from the forest changed. They saw a new stillness in her, a self-containment that was both alluring and intimidating. She did not seek to explain. How could she? The truth was a language they did not speak. At night, alone in her small room, she would sometimes let her hands drift over her own body, not in an act of passion but of remembrance. She would close her eyes and feel the echo of the village, the drumbeat, the steam from the baths, the feeling of furs against her bare back, the philosophy of freedom whispered in the dark. A single hot tear would trace a path down her temple, but it was not a tear of self-pity. It was a tear of gratitude for a beauty so intense that the memory of it was a constant, sweet agony. She had thought, in those first days back, that she had lost everything. But she came to understand that she had lost nothing. The village had not been taken from her. It had been given to her. It was not a place one lived in, but a truth one carried. Kaylin's final lesson had been the truest of all. To be unbound was not a geographical state, but a state of the soul. One afternoon, standing at the edge of the familiar forest, the one that now held no hidden valleys, only trees and game trails, she pulled the red hood over her hair. The sun caught the wool, and for a breathtaking second, it seemed to glow from within, a deep, pulsing crimson. A smile touched her lips, the first true, unshadowed smile since her return. It was not a smile for the past, but for the present. The freedom was not back there, in a lost village of desire. It was here in the steady beat of her own heart. It was in the knowledge that she owned herself completely. The cloak was not a reminder of what was lost. It was a banner of what she had found. She turned her back on the forest and walked towards the cottage, towards the simple bread and the plain honey, towards a life that was smaller, but was now lived by a woman who was infinitely larger. The path behind her was gone. The path ahead was her own. And so the path through the woods ends, for now. But every ending is a beginning in disguise. If this journey of desire and self-discovery resonated with you, if the village of the unbound left its mark on your imagination, then let us continue the story together. Your path now leads you to a place of reviews and whispers. Seek out this audiobook on your platform of choice. Leave a rating, write a comment, or share it with a fellow seeker. Your thoughts are the fire around which we gather. They guide other listeners to this hidden tale. What was real? The village or the transformation? Who do you think the wolf truly was? Share your theories. I am listening. Until our paths cross again in another story. Stay curious, and may you always find the courage to wear your own red cloak.